All right, time to begin class. Let's get started on our pursuit of holiness is what we've been working on for a number of weeks and getting close to the end. So we'll start to wrap things up a little bit here tonight. Forgot the announcement. Drama tonight. If you have zebras, which are second graders, they have a drama tonight. Starts at 7:45. We will be done before that, so you can make it to the presentation. All right, now let's go. A real quick review. In the weeks we've been working on this, we defined holiness a little bit. We talked about understanding what it really meant. We looked at the example of Jesus, who was so holy that he was sinless. We talked about how we pursue holiness, and it's a two-part effort. Spirit has a part, and we have a part. And for the last, 3 weeks, we've been working on the world system, how the world system operates and tries to change what God has established, and tries to get us to buy into false values. So hopefully that brings a few thoughts to mind of what we've been talking about. Tonight we're going to tackle some applications. And the applications are, let me show you the ones we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about dress and entertainment and materialism, and do that pretty quickly. Run through those three areas of life and think about what holiness would mean in those three areas. The key word there is thinking. I hope we stir some thinking tonight. You'll notice I did not entitle this Answers About Dress, Entertainment, and Materialism. I don't have any answers. You remember when we first started this, we talked about the danger of making lists and establishing standards of holiness for other people. And all of these areas are areas where we would be tempted to try to do that. Let's just make a list of what's holy and what's unholy. So we're not going to make a list for you, but my goal is to hopefully get you to think about some of these things. Actually, my goal is probably to aggravate you a little bit and get you a little bit unhappy and make you mad at me or whatever with some of the questions that I'll ask, because all of these areas can do that. We're not going to confirm what we approve, not going to confirm what God approves. If you remember, holiness is not about making a list of things and conforming to it. Holiness is thinking as God thinks and willing as God wills. So that's what I want us to get out of this tonight is, okay, in these areas, if I'm going to really pursue holiness, if I'm going to apply the things that we've been talking about for 10 weeks, what would God think about that? What would God want me to do in this area? So we'll look at some scripture, but we'll also ask a lot of questions and hopefully make us think a little bit. So let's tackle the first one, dress. And we talk about how people dress. Is it holy? Would be the first question that we'd ask. Somebody might say, well, should Christians dress any differently than the world? There are some religious groups that have specific standards about that and dress considerably differently than the world. And some would probably even ask, do clothes have anything to do with holiness or worldliness? Because it's all a matter of your thought and your heart and all of that. So What do clothes have to do with it? So those are some questions that might come up. One answer to the question of, is your dress holy? Some people might say, well, it's in fashion. That's the fashion now. Well, we go back to what we've talked about, and part of holiness in Romans 12:2, it says, do not conform to the world. Okay? So, and bear in mind there's a stark distinction between just thinking about living a good life and all of that and being approved by the church and all that. There's a difference between that and really pursuing holiness. If you're really pursuing holiness, you'd read Romans 12:1 and say, do not conform to the world, and you probably wouldn't then answer a question like this by saying, well, it's in fashion. What you're saying is, well, that's what the world approves. Okay? And that's the antithesis of holiness, doing what the world approves. One difficulty in even thinking about the matter of dress is the world changes what's acceptable. Look at history, and you'll see all manner of dress that was considered acceptable and moral and immoral and modest and immodest and all that. And boy, has that changed through the centuries and through the decades and through the last couple of years, for that matter. The world changes things all the time. The other problem with talking about the matter of dress and seeing this audience, I probably won't get a whole lot of upset people about it, but a much younger demographic would probably find some of this really offensive, because you can't judge, is the younger demographic's mindset. You got to let people be free to express themselves and all of that. So who are you to talk about how I dress? Okay. Once again, there's a difference between thinking that way and pursuing holiness. It's not about what I approve or what I specify as good dress or bad dress or whatever. It's about, what would God think? And how does this affect all the areas of my life? Balancing what the world thinks and what's acceptable to a person pursuing holiness and all that, it's difficult. And I'm not saying any of this is easy. It is difficult. Some of it's difficult. Some of it's real easy. I mean, like fashion. Some fashion is really stupid. You know, I mean, you can argue if you want, but it's just clueless. I went to the store the other day, and actually this woman came out and was walking to her car, and I've kind of got where I understand that the ripped jeans are, well, okay, somebody thinks that's fashion. Makes no sense to me, but bear in mind I grew up with great big hard patches on the knees of my jeans, so that's what I'm used to. But ripped jeans are cool now. But this woman actually, and I have to describe it, it was cut about here, and it went down like this, and there was a little strap of jeans left down here, and then it was cut clear down, and there was a little cuff down at the bottom, but her whole leg was completely bare. Her both legs. And I guess that's a fashion, I don't know. She didn't look that poor, but so I guess it's fashion. I restrained myself. I didn't say a word. I didn't ask her, ma'am, don't you have a mirror in your house? You know, I mean, so, and I don't know if that's modest or immodest, but it's just goofy, uh, in my opinion. But I'm not here to give you my opinion. I don't know how I got on that track, but this is difficult. So, okay, so when we think about dress, when I put that word up there, the first thing that most of you thought of, I bet, is modest or immodest. Is this modest dress or is this immodest? Okay, now that's the most likely place to go on dress. It's not the only place to go to talk about holy dress, but it's a place. And the Bible does talk about that. So let's look at a couple of verses that help us see what God's standard is. And it's in 1 Timothy 2 is the most germane passage. 1 Timothy 2, verse 9 says, women should adorn themselves in respectable apparel with modesty and self-control. Okay, well, I'm already in trouble here. That's with a little different demographic, probably. That would be the first question. Why are you picking on women? Well, why does the Bible just pick on women? Why doesn't it tell men to dress modestly? Well, men are certainly included in dressing respectably and all that. But, and I know it's not politically correct today, but there's a difference between men and women. Okay? And that's why Paul addresses this to Timothy and he addresses it to women. Men are different than women. Men are visually stimulated. Men are visually attracted. Okay? And so that's why he addresses women here in particular, and that's why modesty is usually thought of in the female gender. Okay, women should adorn themselves in respectable apparel with modesty and self-control, not with braided hair and gold or pearls or costly attire, but with what is proper for women who profess godliness with good works. Okay. Now, some people, and here's a good example of holiness, the tract I read to you from in the first week or so about standards of holiness of one religious group, they put that in there about women's hair, about what's an acceptable woman's hairstyle. And this says, not with braided hair and gold or pearls or costly attire. It's, like I said, fashion changes, cultures change. And in this culture, that was how women showed that they had means, that they were richer than others, was they braided their hair and they put gold and pearls and costly things in their hair and they drew attention to that and all that. But if you read this passage, Paul's not talking about hairstyles. Read it again and look what he says. How should women adorn themselves? Well, in respectable attire, with modesty and self-control, not with showy hairstyles or costly attire. But they should adorn themselves with what is proper for women who profess godliness with good works. That's what they adorn themselves with. So what he's really saying is, women, don't draw attention to yourselves by the outward appearance, but with who you are, with your good works. He makes that clearer in the next couple of verses, Peter makes it clearer, 1 Peter 3 says almost the same thing, but puts a little different slant on it. He says, do not let your adorning be external, the braiding of hair and the putting on of gold jewelry or the clothing you wear. But let your adorning be the hidden person of the heart with the imperishable beauty of a gentle and quiet spirit, which is in God's sight is very precious. Okay? So these two passages mention attire and say that Christian women should take note of it, but that's not how you attract attention. Well, that's the purpose of immodest apparel, the purpose of expensive apparel, the purpose of high fashion apparel is to attract attention. And Paul and Peter both say that's not what a Christian woman thinks about. That's not how they adorn themselves. Actually, if you read these two passages, they're much more about, and remember we talked about the three plays of Satan. When we talk about modest or immodest, we immediately go to desire of the flesh. Okay, we think about sexual attraction. These two passages are really about the pride of life. Okay? So it's not about the sexual part of it. It's about what you do to attract people to look at you, how you adorn yourself. The inward, both Paul and Peter say, is much more important than the outward. Okay? So the inward's a lot more important than the outward, but the outward still matters. Okay? Clothes communicate something, and we know that. Now, the world system tells us, no, doesn't matter. If you're happy with what you're doing, that's fine, and you do what you want, and everybody else shouldn't judge. But clothes communicate. And anybody with half sense that goes to a job interview knows that. Okay? People that don't have good sense or haven't been raised right don't know that. Okay? It communicates something about you. The situation you're in, where you are, what message you're trying to send, clothes are a big part of communicating that. Okay? So Paul and Peter here are saying, okay, women, you communicate who you are a different way. You don't do it with the outward appearances. Okay, so let's talk about a couple of problem areas in discerning holiness in dress, on modesty or immodesty. Defining the boundaries is difficult. I mean, at one extreme of modest dress, I guess we'd put a burqa, a full body burqa, where all you can see is the eyes. Okay, there's nothing immodest about that, I guess. Okay, and the other end is a string bikini or something. Okay, hardly dressed at all. Okay, now we're in between there. Anybody's ever had a teenager, especially a teenage daughter, has probably dealt with this. Where's the line? Well, what's modest and when does it become immodest? And that's hard to decide that in some ways. One way to illustrate that, if you have to illustrate it to your child, is a logical argument. Famous one is the argument of the beard, which is a logical fallacy. How many hairs constitute a beard? Okay, I can look at Brian and I can say, he's got a beard. Okay, but if the boss said, okay, I want you to hire only people that have beards, and some guy comes in with one hair, is that a beard or not? I know that sounds silly, but it's the logical fallacy of where do you define that? When is a skirt too short? When is a top too revealing? Okay? And drawing the exact line on that is an impossibility. Now, we know it when we see it. Some guy came in with one hair, I would say not only does he have issues, he doesn't have a beard. Okay. But we know a beard when we see it. Okay. The quote I wrote down a long time ago, somebody said about this, we cannot allow the difficulty of making precise distinctions frighten us into making no distinctions at all. Okay. And that's the game that people will play with you, especially teenagers. Well, this is okay. And then another inch is okay. Another inch this way is okay, whatever. Okay? And you can't define it precisely, but you still got to make a distinction. Okay? So defining it, you got to admit up front, okay, this is hard. I can't tell you exactly what it is. We used to have all kinds of standards for teen camp and other things. And I think we evolved to the point where if it's not acceptable to the director, then it's not acceptable. We're not measuring things. We're not trying to define the exact length of this or that. We know when it's acceptable and when it isn't. Okay, the setting of the boundaries is the trick that comes in on modesty versus immodesty. We're going to have to hurry here. Parents get to decide. If your parents don't know that, Ephesians 6:1, you get to decide. Children are supposed to obey you. Okay. So you may not be able to define it perfectly, but you set the standard. Nope, that's not acceptable. Yep, that is. Okay. Elders should be able to set standards. Okay. I know that wouldn't go over well, but Hebrews 13 says, obey the elders. Submit yourself to them, because they're looking out for your souls. Okay, they ought to be able to. Older women are told to teach younger women how to do things right. They ought to be able to counsel. I'm not saying this is easy. I know it's difficult with the mindset that people have often, but those things ought to be able to be done. And they wouldn't be a problem if people were truly pursuing holiness. Okay, now I spent too much time on modesty versus immodesty. That's not the only way to think about or apply holiness to dress. Listen, Jesus said in Matthew 6:20, why are you anxious about clothing? Okay. Now, I know he was saying, God will provide for you. Don't worry about what you wear. God will provide clothes for you. I know that's what he was saying, but the question's a bigger one. Why are you anxious about clothing? And when you apply holiness to this matter of dress, then you start asking other questions. There are people that either knowingly or unknowingly have bought into the world system that have to have the right designer label. Okay? It's a lot cheaper at Walmart, but man, you can't be seen in that. You got to have the right label. You guys looking at me like you don't know anybody like that. There are people like that. I didn't check your shirt coming in, but some people have to have that. Some people have to have the latest fashion. Have to be in fashion. And that's hard to do because fashion, that's the way fashion works, is they keep changing it all the time. I've got lots of ties in my closet. Some of them are too wide right now, but they'll be back. Okay. Fashion will change pretty soon. And I'll quit wearing the thin ones and start wearing the wide ones again. Okay. That's the way fashion works. Okay. Some people take that to the extreme. They gotta have the latest fashion. Another big part of it is, like I said already, this is not necessarily a matter of just desire of the flesh. This is pride of life. Okay? Some people have to dress to impress. Okay? If you're pursuing holiness, you ask those kind of questions. Okay, we spent too much time on that, but let's go fast now. Entertainment. And once again, here, when we think about entertainment, well, let's define it before we start thinking about it. I'm calling entertainment any kind of diversion or amusement or fun or relaxation, generally thought of as non-spiritual. Okay. Now, and I know there's an overlap here. Like if your relaxation is going out in nature and taking hikes, okay, you can see God while you're there. It can be a spiritual thing. But to define amusement or entertainment here, let's kind of stick with that. Stuff you do that's just for relaxation, just for fun. Okay. So I put a few up here: listening to music, playing games, board games, video games, whatever, reading, sports, nature, hobbies, social media, gambling, collecting things. Some people are big collectors. That's their hobby. Watching movies, exercising. Some people run. Some people work out all the time. All those things are you do for diversion or amusement and relaxation. 2 Timothy, chapter 3, I think it is, Paul told Timothy that in the last days, people would become lovers of pleasure rather than lovers of God. Okay? They love their pleasure, their relaxation, their amusement, their entertainment, their fun. And nothing's inherently wrong with any of these. Some of you might say, well, gambling's inherently wrong. Depends how you define gambling. Every time I preached against gambling, the farmers would always come up and say, what do you think I do? Right, Mike? So it depends how you define it. But let's look at some things that God said about this. 1 Corinthians 6:12. Paul said, all things are lawful for me, but not all things are helpful. All things are lawful, but I'll not be dominated by anything. I'll not be mastered by anything. Okay? Now, if you go back and look at that list of things, you know people who have been mastered by one of those. They do a lot more of it than is healthy for a lot of different reasons. They're mastered by it. 1 Corinthians 10:23, he says again, almost the same thing. He says, all things are lawful, but not all things are helpful. All things are lawful, but not all things build up. So, if pursuing holiness is thinking as God thinks, when we consider an entertainment, we'd ask these questions. We wouldn't just ask, is it legal? We wouldn't just ask, can I afford it? We'd say, is this helpful? Does this build up? Is this getting control of me? Okay? Look at another one that we might consider. 1 Corinthians 10:31, Paul said, whether you eat or drink or whatever you do, that includes entertainment. That's in whatever. Whatever you do it for the glory of God. Okay? So if you're pursuing holiness, that'd be another question you ask. Is this helpful? Is this building up? Is this mastering me? Is this somehow can be used to the glory of God? Okay? So when you think about entertainment, it's easy to draw the line and say, well, okay, don't watch pornography. Okay, well, don't watch R-rated movies. Yeah, and draw an artificial line and say, don't do this, do this. But when you're pursuing holiness and you think about entertainment, there's a whole lot more in this. Here's some I thought of. How does this entertainment affect my mind, my morals? First off, how does it affect my stewardship of finances? I mean, that's one answer, is I can afford it. Why shouldn't I do it? Well, that's the best use of your finances that God has given you? Now, anytime you start thinking like this, it's easy to swing the pendulum all the other way and say, okay, the best way to deal with this then, if you really want to be holy, is take a vow of poverty and wear a hair shirt, go into a monastery so you don't have any dress problems, you don't have any material problems, you don't have any entertainment problems, and that's not the way to handle it. Remember our quote early on, holiness does not consist in uncommanded austerities, but in thinking as God thinks and willing as God wills. So how does it affect the stewardship of your finances? How does it affect your stewardship of time? How much time am I spending on this that taking away from family, is taking away from this, taking away from serving at church, whatever? How does it affect this? How does it affect your children? Your entertainment is teaching children what's important. How does it affect your influence with others? Your entertainment, other people are watching that, paying attention to it. How does it affect your influence? All right, 5 minutes, quickly. Materialism. Should have put these in reverse order, so we spent more time on materialism, because we are all seduced by materialism. Okay. I think it's safe to say that we in American society are pretty materialistic. Okay. We've all been seduced by that in different ways. One example I always use is the oldest relative that I've traced in genealogy was Thomas Tandy. I've got his estate, a list of what he had when he died. He was a farmer in England, and back in the 1500s. His estate, he had 1 cow, 4 sheep, 3 lambs, the corn on the ground, 2 bedsteads, 2 feather beds, and some brass and some pewter. Okay, that's what he owned. Okay. In 2022, we can't build enough storage facilities to put our stuff that won't fit in our house. You know, tell me that materialism hasn't got us. It has. We have lots of stuff. 1 Timothy, let's look at that since we're running out of time. 1 Timothy 6, you might want to look this up. A little too small to read maybe, but 1 Timothy 6, beginning at verse 6, Paul said, godliness with contentment is great gain. We brought nothing into the world. We can't take anything out of the world. Stuff, material stuff, is temporal. It's just here. But if we have food and clothing, with these we'll be content. Paul said we don't need a whole lot. Materialism tells you you need more. Okay, that's the world system, changing price tags and saying the more stuff you have, better off you are. Paul says if you got food and clothing, you ought to be content. Then he warns, but those who desire to be rich fall into temptation, into a snare, into many senseless and harmful desires that plunge people into ruin and destruction. For the love of money is a root of all kinds of evil. It's through this craving that some have wandered away from the faith and pierced themselves with many pangs. Okay? So riches aren't the problem. The desire to have riches is the problem. He said that gets you in all sorts of trouble. That just causes all kinds of messes. And you look at the news and you see it. People get in all sorts of trouble because they're desiring riches. They want to have more and more. He goes on, and the rest later in the passage, verse 17, he says it's all right to be rich. He's writing to Christians here. He says, as for the rich in this present age, charge them not to be haughty, nor to set their hopes on the uncertainty of riches, but on God, who richly provides us with everything to enjoy. Here's what the rich are supposed to do. They are to do good, to be rich in good works, to be generous, and ready to share, thus storing up treasure for themselves as a good foundation for the future, so that they may take hold of that which is truly life. Okay, materialism is an attitude about things. Okay? I could make a list of things that you have that you don't need. But we don't make lists for you. I should make a list for me. I have things that I don't need. Okay? And you read what Paul said to Timothy here. He said, you don't need a whole lot, and it's all temporal anyway. And if you desire more stuff, you're going to get in all sorts of trouble. People that do have a lot of stuff ought to be generous. They ought to share. I'll be ready to share. Okay. Close with this. A few warning signs of materialism. Overspending, getting in debt, dishonesty, working too much, discontentment. If you're not content with what you have, you always got to have the next best thing. Getting confused between what you want and what you need. That's one of the most helpful definitions you can make in your life. So Cindy and I started that a long time ago, and it settled a lot of things. We'll be someplace walking through a tourist shop or something, and she'll pick something up and say, this is really cool. And I say, yeah, it is. Is it a want or a need? And she'll put it back down and say, it's just a want. Okay, and then she'll do the same thing to me later. Of course, sometimes you need a new shotgun, but sometimes you have to ask, do you want this or need it? And the last one I put down is, do you have wrong priorities on giving? Are you able to give to help some cause that you think, man, I'd really like to help with that, but man, I can't pay the bills this month. I've got all this stuff, but I can't pay the bills. So if you get your priorities out of whack there, you may be unholy in the materialism range. Last thing I'll say on materialism is, I forgot to mention it when we started this topic, but Jesus warned a lot about the danger of riches. Okay? And we read those and kind of apply them to ourselves and say, yeah, we got to be careful about riches. He said you can't serve God and money. You don't store up riches and all that. Actually, he said it a lot to the crowds. And it finally struck me one day, okay, these people he's talking to are not like me. These people he's warning about the danger of riches, probably 95% of them had a tent and a pot to cook in and a couple of changes of clothes maybe. That was all they had. That was the masses that came out to see him. And he warned them, be careful about desiring riches. Material things will get you. Okay, so anyhow, those are three areas that, like I said, I got no answers for. I just want you to hopefully think that, okay, in these areas, if I'm pursuing holiness, I got to think about this different than I used to maybe. All right, we'll reconvene next week. Once again, drama presentation, zebras, second graders are performing in 3 minutes.